The world is divided into four spheres, each sphere divided among continents and nations. Nations are divided by borders and interests. These interests divide the news. We examine the impact of these divisions on people and power. This is Imaginary Lines. Welcome to the program. I'm your host, Chris Spanos. Coming up on the show, smartphones play a fundamental role in the everyday life of modern society, but their benefits come with huge social and material costs. I'll speak with Elizabeth Woike, who authored the new book, The Smartphone. But first, a look at how media reports on Latin America. More than 20 leading British intellectuals released a statement supporting Argentine President Cristina Fernandez. The academics recently criticized media for its use of the 1994 bombing of the Argentine Jewish Mutual Association, also known as AMIA. They especially criticized the media's use of the death of the prosecutor investigating the attack, Alberto Nisman, in order to criticize President Fernandez. In a joint statement, the British intellectuals, including prestigious Professor Doreen Massey, slammed UK media for implying that Fernandez and Foreign Minister Hector Timerman are responsible for withholding evidence in the Buenos Aires tragedy and for the murder of prosecutor Alberto Nisman. The statement was prescient, as an Argentine federal judge, February 26th, released his statement dismissing allegations from the late prosecutor Alberto Nisman, alleging that President Cristina Fernandez attempted to cover up the involvement of Iranian officials in the bombing of the AMIA Jewish Center in Buenos Aires. Smartphones have evolved to play a fundamental role in our everyday lives. They have come to mediate information and social relationships. We use them for almost every conceivable purpose, and their role will only expand into the future. But the genius of the smartphone comes at a high social and material cost. Elizabeth Woike has covered the telecom and mobile industry since 2007. She is a former Businessweek and Forbes staff writer. Most recently, she authored the book, The Smartphone: Anatomy of an Industry. She joins me to discuss the costs and benefits of the smartphone. Hi, Elizabeth. Welcome to Imaginary Lines.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for having me on.
First, can you give a thumbnail overview of how the smartphone has evolved and the role it plays today?
Well, as I think we all know, we've had cell phones around for decades. But I would say that the modern smartphone, again, and we also had smartphones before the iPhone, but I would really sort of draw a demarcating line in 2007 when the first iPhone was introduced, and say that the modern smartphone era has occurred since then. And what I mean by modern smartphone is a smartphone that is, for all intents and purposes, a mini computer, a mobile computer. So virtually anything you can do on a full-fledged computer, you can do on a smartphone.
Hidden behind the slick touchscreens and ringtones, smartphone production has a serious impact on people and the environment. Many have heard about Apple and China. What more can you tell me about how smartphones impact labor and environmental standards?
Right. So there's really in a lot of ways, and that's because smartphones are such complicated products. They have extremely complex supply chains involved. By the time you, the consumer, get your smartphone, dozens of companies generally have been involved in the making of it, and sort of dozens of people have touched that phone. But for the most part, when we talk about labor, we're looking at the sort of final assembly of the smartphones. And as you mentioned, a lot of attention has been focused on the people in China, the laborers in China who are the final assemblers of the iPhone. Now that is a situation that has improved slightly. I would say it has improved a little bit since 2012, which is when Tim Cook, the Apple CEO, took over Apple. And Tim Cook had been in charge of all of Apple's supply chain relationships because he had been the chief operating officer of Apple for years. And so I would say that he sort of stepped up a little bit more when he became CEO in terms of improving labor conditions for those workers. And again, a lot of that also was in a response to labor organizations and activist groups. I interviewed some of those groups for my book. Those groups almost always focus on Apple as their target. So some of the changes have been reactionary, some have been, I would say, more proactive. But if you talk about some of those changes, working hours has been a big focus. Occasionally, especially in the run-up to a new iPhone launch, these final assembly workers can work as many as 80 hours a week. There's a lot of overtime involved. They're standing on their feet the whole time. They're not allowed to talk. They're not really allowed to take bathroom breaks, only with permission. It's very limited. So it's a very grueling type of work. And so a lot of the focus has been to get those hours down to 60 hours, and then even lower than that. Because actually, if believe it or not, the Chinese law is 47 or 48 hours a week. So it's much lower than actually what these workers are doing. There has also been some progress in terms of making the sort of labor conditions a little safer in terms of health effects. So a lot of times these workers are exposed to dangerous chemicals, and you think about sort of when they're cleaning the screens, there's a lot of sort of sanitary circumstances, obviously, in making a smartphone. Everything has to be perfectly clean and sanitized. And so some of these chemicals like hexane and benzene were being used to do things like clean screens, and now Apple, for instance, has banned them. Again, that was mostly in response to activist pressure, but they did that last August. And so then in terms of environmental costs and effects, again, you can look at that at sort of many different points along the smartphone sort of supply chain and development process, but for the most part, people focus on the afterlife of the smartphone. And that is because people go through smartphones so quickly. So again, unlike a gadget such as a TV, no one replaces their TV after 1 or 2 years, but many people replace their smartphones after 1 or 2 years. So while the volume, the actual size of the smartphone is not large, the volume in terms of numbers is very large. And so we have this issue where at the end of a smartphone's life, sort of in what country does it end up and how does it get recycled, and is it being recycled properly? We want to make sure that companies that are known as certified recyclers, that are sort of doing recycling to a higher standard, are the ones who are being asked to recycle. But of course, that's very difficult if the phone is ending up in a developing country. Most of these countries are not going to have a quote unquote certified recycling program set up.
NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden has leaked bombshell reports about how the NSA has spied on smartphone users. But your book also outlines other problems that users may be less familiar with. What are some of these other problems?
Right, so I focused a lot on mobile apps because that is something that's not only specific to smartphones. You're not using mobile apps on other devices, obviously, but because mobile apps are they're such a central part of the smartphone experience. Virtually everyone who has a smartphone is using some type of app. And so I talk about how mobile apps, basically all the different ways in which they can track you. And it's sort of amazing, actually. I think we know that sort of navigational apps can tell where we are. So there's location, there's GPS, and I think we're sort of cognizant of that. But I also talk about a lot of apps, for instance, games. We usually don't think that games are tracking us in any way because you think, why would a game maker need or want to do so? But for the most part, they are doing it, and they're doing it for advertising and marketing purposes. So a lot of the world's most popular games, Angry Birds, for instance, I mentioned in my book, they are basically collecting as much information as possible from the user. So, they're looking at anything from the other apps you have installed on your phone, how frequently you're using those other apps. If they're able to, they're trying to get your sort of username, that might be your Gmail address or something. They're certainly trying to figure out where you're located. They're often trying to tie to, if they can, what you're looking at on the mobile web, what other things you're sort of surfing around and looking at. And they kind of will build a profile of you. And for the most part, those game makers aren't really storing that information themselves. But there are a lot of intermediaries, ad networks, and other companies that they work with who are storing that information. Again, usually, it's anonymous, so they're not saying, it's not under your name. But most people, I think, most smartphone users, were they to be aware of this practice, it does give them pause. They start to think, hey, I thought this was a free app, I was downloading it for fun and I wasn't paying any money, but now suddenly I might view it in a different way if I feel that my sort of, my privacy is being impinged just for, and maybe it's an app they don't even use.
Finally, in your book, you propose what you call a smartphone Bill of Rights. Tell me about this Bill of Rights and what you hope can be achieved by it.
Right. So that was an idea because that came out of the book writing process, because we didn't want to simply, I guess we wanted it to be news you can use. So the idea is that, once you read the book, you will probably develop some opinions about what you would like your smartphone companies to do. And then this Bill of Rights is sort of a list of things, kind of principles that I think all smartphone companies should abide by. And then if they're not abiding by them, you as a consumer should and can, sort of agitate or pressure the companies to do so. But, I talk about being able to more transparency in the pricing process. To your point about the labor and environmental pieces, I think that people, consumers who care about those things should be able to find out what their smartphone makers' policies on those issues are. And so, whether that's a section on each smartphone maker's website that talk about these are the suppliers we use, these are our efforts, for instance, to get to a living wage for the final assembly workers we use. And then I also talk about some issues of security, so encryption, for instance. I think, for instance, the Edward Snowden revelations have made consumers much more aware of hacking and encryption principles like that.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for joining me on Imaginary Lines.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
The New York Times recently reported to its readers, March 1st, how Germany's insistence that Greece adhere to an austerity plan is motivated by a desire to protect German taxpayers. But economist Dean Baker counters that this is clearly not the case. In Baker's Beat the Press blog, he explains that most of Greece's debt is owed to official lenders, who have no need to make demands on Germany's taxpayers. Rapid growth in the Eurozone will allow Greece to repay a larger portion of its debt and also improve Germany's budget situation. For this reason, Baker writes, it's hard to see how German taxpayers will derive any benefit from austerity in Greece. That's it for today's Imaginary Lines. Thanks for watching. I'm your host, Chris Spanos. Please join me next week.